Now we come to introduction of tongue. What do we mean by tongue? Tongue is basically highly muscular organ situated on the floor of oral cavity. It is responsible for deglutition, for mastication, and for production of speech. Now we come to the parts of tongue. Basically, tongue has two surfaces, superior and inferior surface. Now the tongue, it has been divided into three main parts. What are the parts? They are the anterior part, the posterior part, and the posterior most part. Now, what are the boundaries that demarcate each part from the other? Now, you can see there is a V-shaped margin. Yes, you can see this V-shaped margin that I am drawing right here. It separates this anterior part from the posterior part. The apex of the V, it is lying or it is pointing posteriorly, and it is called sulcus terminalis. Yes, sulcus terminalis is basically a depression that is present on the superior surface of tongue, and it divides the anterior part from the posterior part. Now, what are the characteristic feature of this anterior part? Remember, another name of this anterior part is papillary part. Why it is called papillary part? Because this is the only part of the tongue which contains papilla. What are the four types of papilla we see? They are mainly circumvallate papilla, fungiform papilla, filiform papilla, and the last, it is the foliate papilla. Let us see the papilla. What are the regions which contain this papilla, or at which parts each of these papilla are present dominantly on the anterior part of tongue. So you see that the circumvallate papilla, it is mainly present anterior to the margin of sulcus terminalis. So if this is the tongue and this is the sulcus terminalis, then the circumvallate papilla, they are present like this. Yes. Now we come to the foliate papilla and the filiform papilla. This is the foliate and filiform papilla. So both foliate and filiform papilla, they are present on the lateral margin of the tongue. But remember, foliate papilla, they are present just near the circumvallate papilla. On the other hand, the filiform papilla, they are predominantly present on the tip and the borders of the tongue, which is distal to the circumvallate papillae. Okay, and which papilla we are left with? We are leaving the fungiform papilla, and always remember that the remaining superior surface, yes, the remaining part of the superior surface, it is covered, or it is predominantly covered with this fungiform papilla, which I am highlighting with black color. Yes, this is the main distribution of papilla. If you want to draw it in exam, then you can simply draw like this. Okay, now we come to the posterior part of tongue. So what is the characteristic feature of the posterior part of tongue? Remember that the posterior part of tongue, it is also known as lymphoid part. Yes, why this is called lymphoid part? Because the lymphoid follicles are present, and these lymphoid follicles, they actually aggregate to form the palatine tonsil. We know that palatine tonsil, it is an aggregation of lymphoid follicles. Okay, after this we are having another region which is known as the posterior most region. But before going there, let me tell you one thing, that what is the position of each region, that is the anterior region and the posterior region. Remember that this anterior region, it is basically present on the floor of the oral cavity. Yes, on the floor of the oral cavity. And what about the posterior region? Remember that this posterior region, it forms the anterior wall of oropharynx. So if you are asked that which part of tongue forms the anterior wall of oropharynx, then it will be the posterior region. Okay, now let us come to the posterior most region. Remember that posterior most region, it is responsible for the root of the tongue. That is, it actually attaches the tongue to the structures of our body so that we cannot swallow the tongue along with our deglutition. Hence, we have the posterior most part of the tongue, it is fixed. On the other hand, the posterior and the anterior most part of tongue, they are movable. Yes, now the posterior most part of the tongue, it is mainly attached to epiglottis with the help of three glossoepiglottic fold. We are highlighting this. This is the median glossoepiglottic fold. But if you look at the term, that is the glossoepiglottic fold, glosso means tongue, epiglottic means epiglottis. So it is mainly a fold of mucous membrane that attaches the posterior most part of tongue to the epiglottis. And what are the three epiglottic fold? One is the median epiglottic fold, and on each side we are having two lateral lateral glossoepiglottic fold. So between one median and one lateral glossoepiglottic fold, you will find one depression. You can see this depression. This depression is known as vallecula. Yes, this depression is known as vallecula. Okay. In this way, we have completed the parts of tongue. Now let us go to the attachments of tongue. Now you can see that this is basically a diagram of the attachment of tongues, and we are here in this diagram we highlight the various extrinsic muscle of tongue. That is, the extrinsic muscle of tongue, they are responsible for attachment of its root to our various body parts. For example, if you take into account the palatoglossus muscle, it mainly binds or it mainly attaches the root of lung to the soft palate. Yes, and again, if you take into account the hyoglossus muscle, this is the hyoglossus muscle, it attaches the root of tongue to the hyoid bone. So here I divide the attachment into two parts, above attachment and below attachment, that is the superior and the inferior attachment. So the root of tongue, it is attached above to the soft palate with the help of palatoglossus. Yes, and again here it has not been shown, so I draw it, that it is also attached to the styloid process with the help of styloglossus muscle. Okay, it is the attachment above. Now we come to the attachment below, that it is attached to the hyoid bone with the help of hyoglossus muscle. So below hyoglossus. And also remember one thing, that it is again attached to the mandible. Yes, so this root of the tongue is attached to the genial tubercle, the genioid tubercle of mandible with the help of genioglossus muscle. So this first palatoglossus, then styloglossus, then hyoglossus, then genioglossus, these are the four extrinsic muscle of tongue, and we are going to discuss of each of the functions of each of the muscle in our subsequent slides. Okay, now we come to the intrinsic muscle of tongue. So what is the meaning of the word intrinsic and extrinsic? We know this. Intrinsic means it is present interiorly, that is, its origin and insertion is inside the tongue, but extrinsic means that its origin and insertion is not inside the tongue. Okay, one of the attachment, that is either origin or insertion, is just outside the tongue. Now first we come to the intrinsic muscle. So always remember that intrinsic muscle, it contains two longitudinal, one transverse and one vertical. Okay, the longitudinal, two longitudinal includes superior and inferior longitudinal, that is they are present along the length of the tongue, one present superiorly, one present inferiorly. And the transverse muscle, they are actually present just 90-degree, or they are just present perpendicular to this longitudinal muscles, yes, on its plane. Okay, and vertical muscles, they are present vertical to the plane of the tongue. Now in order to visualize its function, let me go to another slide, but before going there, you just have a look of each of the intrinsic muscles so that you can visualize here that this is the superior longitudinal muscle. For example, if this is the tongue, yes, so the superior longitudinal muscle, it will go like this. It will go along the length of the, along the length. This is the superior longitudinal, and inferior longitudinal, it will be present just inferior to it. So I cannot show this in this diagram. Okay, it will traverse the entire length like this only, but it is present inferior to superior longitudinal. What will be the transverse? Yes, the transverse, they are present like this. And what will be the vertical muscles? The vertical muscles, they are present perpendicular to both superior, they are present perpendicular to both longitudinal and the transverse muscle. So if I got a transverse section like this, then the vertical muscles will be present like this. Okay, they are present the perpendicular to this transverse muscle and also perpendicular to this superior and inferior longitudinal muscle. Okay, now let us have the functions of the longitudinal muscle. Now you always remember, when you come to the function of the intrinsic muscle, remember one line, that the intrinsic muscles are responsible for the shape and size of tongue. Remember, not the position. Extrinsic muscles are responsible for the position of the tongue. On the other hand, intrinsic muscles are responsible for shape and size of the tongue. Now we come to the first one, that is the longitudinal. The superior longitudinal, this is the superior longitudinal, and this is the inferior longitudinal. Remember, both the longitudinal muscle, if they contract, they decrease the length. Yes, they are responsible for decreasing the length of tongue. Okay, this is the impact on size of tongue. Okay, now we come to decrease in length, means the shortening of tongue. Now we come to the shape. What will be the impact on the contraction of superior and inferior longitudinal on the shape of tongue? Now you have to visualize it with on your own, that you see that if the superior longitudinal muscle, if it contracts, then what it will do, that basically it will make the superior surface of the tongue concave. So it will be like this. Yes, you see that this is the superior longitudinal muscle, it contracts and it will make the superior surface of the tongue concave, along with shortening the length of the tongue. And what will be the case of the inferior longitudinal muscle contraction? It will basically make the superior surface of the tongue convex, along with shortening the length of the tongue. Okay, this is the function of the longitudinal muscle. Now we come to the transverse muscle. You see that this is the transverse, these are the orientation of the transverse muscle. So what will happen if the transverse muscle shortens? Yes, you can visualize that the transverse muscle, if it shortens or if it contracts, then it will narrows the width of the tongue. It will narrow the width of the tongue along with it. This is the impact on shape. Yes, and what will be the impact on size? It will elongate the tongue. So what it can do, it will elongate the tongue, it will make the tongue thick. Yes, it will make the tongue thick, and along with it, it will narrow the tongue. These are the functions, and here you can see that what will be the impact. It will increase the length, that is elongate it. Along with this, it will narrow the width of the tongue. Now we are having only one intrinsic muscle, that is the vertical muscle. Yes, so what will be the impact on shape and size of tongue if the vertical muscle contract? In order to visualize it in a more clear-cut manner, we have taken a transverse section of tongue. This lower muscle, this is the transverse muscle. Yes, and perpendicular to this, as I have already said, we are having the vertical muscle. So if the vertical muscle contracts, what you can clearly see that the thickness of the tongue, in case of transverse muscle, the thickness of the tongue, it will increase, the tongue will become more thick. But here you can see the tongue will become flattened. Yes, the tongue will become flattened, that is the thickness, it will decrease. Yes, and what will happen to the relative width of the lung? In case of the transverse muscle, we see that the width of the tongue, it will decrease. Now here in this case, if the vertical muscles, they will contract, they will basically increase the width. They are basically increase the width of the tongue. And what will be the impact on its length? The length, it will decrease. Yes, okay. So if you are going to have a comparative study of the transverse and the vertical muscle, then you can see about the length, that the transverse muscle, it will increase the length. On the other hand, the vertical muscle, it will decrease the length. What will be the width? You see that the transverse muscle, it will decrease the width, the vertical muscle, it will increase the width. What will be the thickness? You see that the transverse muscle, it will basically increase the thickness. On the other hand, the vertical muscle, it will decrease the thickness. This is the comparative study. Okay, and in case of the longitudinal muscle, let us also do the same for the longitudinal muscle also. What will be the impact on length for the contraction of longitudinal muscle? Basically, it will decrease the length. Okay, what will be the width? Yes, the width, it will basically the same, no impact. What will be the impact on thickness? It will basically the same, no impact. So the longitudinal muscle, what is primary function? Primary function is to decrease the length of the tongue. Okay, after this we come to the extrinsic muscles of tongue. The extrinsic muscle, you see that they are the palatoglossus, styloglossus, genioglossus and hyoglossus. Now what is the similarity of the name of each muscle you can encounter? Yes, basically each of them, they will include the term glossus. So what do we mean by glossus? Glossus means it is the tongue. Yes, it is tongue. And now you take into account the other part of each word. Now first the palatoglossus. So what does it mean? That its attachment, on one side it is the tongue and on the other side it is the soft palate. Now styloglossus, it attaches to the styloid process and the tongue. And what will be genioglossus? It attaches to the genioid tubercle of mandible and the tongue. And what will be hyoglossus? Its attachment is hyoid bone and tongue. Okay, now have a look at this diagram. You can see that this is the genioglossus. Yes, this is the hyoglossus, this is the styloglossus, and this is the palatoglossus. Okay, now although a little bit this diagram is confusing and it can't give that complete three-dimensional view, so I think that in order to do this I have to go to the next slide. But you see that this is the genioglossus. Yes, it is attached, it is a fan shaped muscle. Always remember the genioglossus, it is a fan shaped muscle. It always attaches tongue to the mandible. The styloglossus, yes, it attaches, you see here that it attaches the root of the tongue to the styloid process. Along with it, the styloglossus is also a part of the styloid apparatus. Okay, the hyoglossus, it attaches tongue to the hyoid bone, and finally we are having palatoglossus, attaches tongue to the soft palate. Now let us come to action of each muscle. It is very important. Okay, so first we write the word glossus. And what are the four muscles? Yes, glossus to soft palate, it is palatoglossus. Tongue to hyoid bone, it is the hyoglossus. Tongue to geniotubercle of mandible, genioglossus. And we are left with tongue to styloid process, that is the styloglossus. Yes, now you have a look at this diagram. Here only the two extrinsic muscles are given. One is the hyoglossus and second one is the palatoglossus. The genioglossus and the styloglossus, they are not given because you see that the palatoglossus and hyoglossus, they are mainly responsible for elevation and depression of tongue. Okay, the other two are responsible for retraction and protrusion of tongue. Now what do we mean by retraction and protrusion? You see that the elevation and depression, this term is self-explanatory, but suppose this is a person, and the protrusion means that if you actually protrude the tongue out, okay, you make the tongue come out, then it will known as protrusion of tongue. And if you make the tongue come in, then it is known as retraction. This is a general meaning of the word protrusion and retraction. Okay, now you see that this, what will be the function of each muscle. First, this palatoglossus and hyoglossus. Palatoglossus, you see that it is actually attached tongue, it attaches tongue superiorly to the soft palate, so it is responsible for elevation or depression. Yes, you get, it is elevation. And what about hyoglossus? It depresses the tongue. Now we come to genioglossus and styloglossus. Always remember, these are the two muscles which are responsible for protrusion and retraction of tongue, the meaning you know. So genioglossus, it is actually attached anteriorly to the genioid tubercle, so it is responsible for protrusion of tongue. And the styloglossus, it is actually attached superiorly. Yes, it is attached posteriorly to the styloid process, so it is responsible for retraction of tongue. Now in order to have a better view of the function of each muscle, let us take into account a very crucial function of our digestive system of or our GIT, which is known as deglutition. Yes, now what will be the role of each extrinsic muscle in deglutition? Let us have a look at it. You see in this diagram, this is the third diagram where you can clearly visualize the deglutition process. This is the deglutition process. Okay, so during the deglutition process, the basic step, the most important step is that the oropharyngeal isthmus, it will open. Now what will be the structure which guards the oropharyngeal isthmus? Yes, it is the epiglottis. So epiglottis basically sorry, not epiglottis, the oropharyngeal isthmus, it is guarded by soft palate, and if the soft palate it will actually be elevated, then what will happen? The oropharyngeal isthmus opens. But what will be the role of tongue in opening of the oropharyngeal isthmus? You can see here that when the oropharyngeal isthmus closed, yes, when the oropharyngeal isthmus closed, in this diagram, what you can see? The tongue, yes, the tongue, it is elevated and this is retracted. So if this is the tongue and it has basically, what are the movements we are taking into account? We basically take into account elevation, depression, protrusion and retraction. So if the tongue it elevates, yes, and if retracts, these two, then the oropharyngeal isthmus closes. Then the oropharyngeal isthmus closes. But if the tongue is protruded and if it is depressed, then the oropharyngeal isthmus opens. Here, what is the criteria? The tongue is elevated first with the help of, yes, palatoglossus, and it is retracted with the help of styloglossus. So it will close the oropharyngeal isthmus and the deglutition will not take place. But in this diagram, you can see that the tongue, it is protruded with the help of genioglossus and it is actually depressed, yes, depressed with the help of hyoglossus. So it will open the oropharyngeal isthmus so that the swallowing, yes, the swallowing, it will be easy. What you can say that the epiglottis is closed over the laryngeal inlet. Now we come to the next slide. This will be the final slide of the video, the first session. In the next session we will talk about the nerve supply. So the blood supply and the blood supply includes the arterial and the venous drainage. So the arterial supply, it is mainly by the lingual artery, the tortuous lingual artery, and this tortuous lingual artery, always remember it is tortuous, okay, and this is a branch of external carotid artery. On the other hand, the venous drainage, this is by deep lingual vein and along with it the vena comitans. We know what do we mean by vena comitans. So they are basically the small veins, yes, the vena comitans accompanying hypoglossal nerve and the deep hypoglossal nerve and the lingual artery. We will get two vena comitans, okay, one is accompanying lingual artery, the second one is accompanying hypoglossal nerve. Now the nerve supply I will discuss in my in the next video. Okay, so let us have a brief review of what we have learned in this session. We have learned about the introduction part, we have learned about the parts and attachment, papilla part, yes, then the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles with action, then the arterial supply and venous drainage, and the nerve supply I will deal with in my next video. Okay, thank you very much.